Hello and welcome back to the Incident FM podcast. We're joined today by Lisa and Pete. Lisa, welcome to the podcast. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I am Lisa. I'm the technical lead here at Incident.io. I joined last August, so a year and a bit here, building things and then trying to build a team that builds the thing. So yeah, that's all my jam.
Perfect. And Pete, we've already met you in previous episodes. You're also joined, for those viewers on video, by a cat. Maybe you can introduce your cat to the.
Sorry, we've started now, so I'm not going to go and throw her out. And who knows, she might have more insights than I do. This is Lovelace, and she enjoys sitting on shelves in the background of my podcast episodes. But yeah, it's great to be back. Let's get into it.
Perfect. Well, plug for the YouTube if you want to see Pete's cat, Lovelace. Cool. This week we're going to be talking about the importance of communication during an incident. Very open topic. Not sure where this is going to go, but I want to jump straight in and kick off with maybe for you, Lisa, like what makes the communication aspect of an incident so important?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two parts of this. So there's one part which is important good communication massively accelerates your incident response, and we can talk about that a bit more later. But like, if you communicate well, everyone will know what's happening. The right people can provide input. The right people can get into the room at the right time. And your customers, from an external point of view, they will trust you more. They will probably give you more time, ask you fewer questions, and all of those good things. And then the second part is that it's also the bit that we tend to be really bad at. So it's if you sort of give a particular engineer a technical problem and you're like, fix this problem. It's like, right, full steam ahead, blinkers on, I will fix the problem. If you say, hey, can you fix this problem and also update all these people really clearly on exactly what's going on at the same time as fixing the problem, that's then a much more difficult thing to do. And so that's why we bring more people into an incident than one, and we have teams, and we build like an ephemeral team in this incident where some people are more external facing and some people are more focused on solving the problem. As with all work things, stuff gets harder when it's more than one person. And it's all about, the way that those relationships work, the way that people communicate with each other inside the incident to drive that good communication for all the other people. And I think that's where this sort of a good incident response can be like made or broken, I guess. It's like our ability to do that and pull together that team to work well.
Yeah, I guess there's an interesting kind of, just jumping in, Charlie, but it's like there's an interesting sort of situation that often occurs where sort of people go like, oh, the overhead isn't worth it, as in like pulling lots of people in is either, I don't know, often it's good motivations, right? It's like, I don't want to distract someone else, or maybe it's like, oh, it'll be quicker if I just fix it. And I think those are like really well-meaning, but I think what Lisa's describing is like, yeah, for me, the sort of golden path and what I'd always push our team to do, which is like kind of, you can rarely go wrong if you pull more people in, but it can definitely go wrong if you keep it really like small and solo. There are a few exceptions to that where there's, maybe you've got a security or a privacy incident where you can't have lots of people involved. But yeah, I think I've seen a lot of like false economy vibes here where someone sort of goes like, oh, it's just not worth it. And it's, in my experience, I think it's almost always worth it more than not. And sort of, yeah, I guess, I don't know, Lisa, there's some kind of, if I don't do that, in your experience, what's happened? Because I feel like both of us have a lot of burned fingers here, and that might be interesting to reflect on and get some sort of resonance with people listening.
Yeah, so I think it's very easy, and I have done this painfully recently, to get into this kind of incident environment. We had a big incident a couple of weeks ago, which I was leading not as effectively as I have led some incidents in the past, shall we say. And primarily the issue was I was very much in fix the thing mode and maybe didn't do as much talking as would have been useful for anybody else. But anyway, more specifically, it's that if you're not communicating with other people, you take away their agency and their ability to be useful. And in all likelihood, in your organization, there are other people who are also good at what they do. And so, I mean, in an ideal world. And so as soon as you stop communicating and create a sort of Chinese wall, that means that other people who think they might have context start to go, oh, can I help? And they start to sort of badger you for updates and ask you questions. And that's honestly quite frustrating because that's obviously not helping, except for the point where sometimes they know something that you don't. And it's really, really important that they badger you and ask you questions until they're like, I think it might be this thing that I did yesterday. Do you want to check that? But if you don't push if you don't push updates to them, they have to sort of come and fight to get your attention, and work out whether what they're saying is relevant at all. So it's a classic, like, it's a bit of a false economy, because then you have to have that conversation with 6 people about the 6 things that they've done over the last 2 days, only one of which is probably relevant. And then the second side is when you're stopping people being able to make good choices about what they're currently doing. So as an example, if your database is really sad and then someone kicks off a backfill that's really database intensive, you're going to be really, really frustrated. But you can't legitimately be annoyed at them unless you've told them that the database is sad and that everybody should not do anything. Same with like, oh, could everyone stop deploying or something like that, right? You should be pushing this stuff out to your team to help them make good choices about whatever they're doing. Otherwise, you could just end up in this really frustrating place where you've made your life significantly worse. And you're just sort of, shouting at somebody through Slack going, please, can you stop the horrible thing now?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess there's also a big kind of, as well as sort of streamlining stuff internally, there's a big external factor here as well. I guess we talked, I guess what you've just described is a lot of the internal consequences. I think there's also external consequences. I think we should maybe talk about this as a separate point a bit later on, but I think it's worth noting that there's a huge amount of upside to communicating well externally to your customers. I mean, it's definitely true internally, but it also applies outside the company. And I think, there's a lot of value in making sure that your customers know that you're on it, even if nothing else. Whereas often, it's similar to the internal incentive. It can often be like, until I know exactly what the problem is, I'm kind of hesitant to say anything because I don't want to look silly. But actually just telling someone like, there is an incident, we think it's not worth deploying. You don't have to be like, I know exactly what it is and why you shouldn't. You can sort of just give a preemptive thing. Ditto with customers. You can sort of say like, we don't quite know what's wrong, but something's wrong. We're investigating. And even that can build up a bit of trust. And that to me is at the root of like why you do all of this, right? Which is kind of, build trust with the people around you. And it's kind of, otherwise you're going to get hammered by people who don't have that trust, and they're going to ask you loads of questions, and they're going to be like, are you really on it? Are you really fixing this incident? So yeah, that's maybe something we could talk about a bit later on, but I think that customer trust and that customer comms piece is really important as well as the internal stuff that we've mentioned already.
Totally.
I think there's like sorry, Charlie, I'm going to make one more small point. There's like a blurred line between like the internal and the external stuff. Like if you're in a bigger org and you're like part of a platform team and your customers are other teams in your organization, that's then sort of all of the same kind of things apply around trust and people feeling more comfortable. And once you build that trust, it gives you that space to actually fix what's gone wrong. But it's also, they're like chips that you can spend in other ways. So once you have that trust from either your customers or from other people in your organization, then you can sort of say, look, I know that you're not 100% sure about this, but trust me, I know what I'm doing. I think that this is the right thing for you to do. And trust becomes like a currency that you can use in that relationship.
Absolutely. Agreed. I'd like to narrow in a little bit on the internal side of communication. We kind of mentioned there, like customer facing, internal. I think I don't think anyone would disagree, like internal comms is going to be really important during an incident, but I wonder if there's any practical like advice, tips, or experiences that you can share in terms of like, how do you achieve that culture of good internal comms during an incident?
No, incident management company, never thought about it. There is. I guess so. There's a few things we could cover here. We also talk about some of the stuff in the incident management guide. So like, go read that. I think it's genuinely like a really good resource. It's like you're going to hear me and Lisa's opinions, but if you want the pooled collective knowledge of everyone at Instant.io and friends, that's the place that I go. So I guess maybe we could just focus on stuff that we've found useful and leave some of the hypothetical stuff that maybe at a much larger company might be really important to folks to read afterwards. But maybe just like, so a few things from me. So I think one is like comms should be a proactive thing. I think you can do really good comms reactively. So for example, when someone asks questions, have a really good response, respond quickly. That's great. That is objectively good comms. But I think the best kind of instant comms are the ones where you're very proactive, right? Where you're kind of ahead of the game. You're getting answers out before people have asked the questions. And sometimes you do that really well, and sometimes you miss the ball, and you're always going to have an element of reactive stuff. But that proactive element of comms can really head off a huge amount of stress for other people in the organization. many of whom are often honestly sitting there being like, I really need to know something, but I'm really hesitant to kind of dive in and ask because everything seems quite on fire right now. And if you make sure you've got someone who's just going out and saying like, I'm here, I'm updating you. If this isn't what you need, tell me what you do need. That's really important. I think doing this on a regular cadence is really valuable as well. So not, if you give an update, like tell people when the next one's coming, right? If they know that you said something half an hour ago and you promised an update in 30 minutes, they're much more likely to be like, hey, it's been 40 minutes and you said you were going to tell me what was happening and I'm kind of sat here with customers yelling at me. Like they're much more likely to ask you. So you make yourself more accessible, but also you kind of help people orient themselves in the incident much more easily, right? Like they land and they go, oh, cool. I know that in like 15 minutes or so, I'm going to get another update. So I maybe hold my questions because they might get answered. So again, you're making your life easier. You're also reducing stress and making everything simpler for everyone else. And then I guess like the last thing, and maybe like Lisa, you could provide some detail on this because I think you're good at it, but it's like, is making sure that the structure's really solid. So it's kind of, if every update is totally different. So imagine you're met with like a wall of text every half an hour and that wall of text will cover wildly different things each time. Someone's ability to join an incident and pass that is like quite difficult. You have to sort of assemble your own model of how what kind of updates you're getting. It's like, oh, okay, so a minute ago they were updating us on like customer impact, and now we're talking about like technical fixes and mitigation processes, and like, so I think I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this one, Lisa. Like, I have my own opinions, but there's often some key points that you want to hit in your incident update structure. And often you want to repeatedly hit that same structure, even if there's nothing, so that people know that now there is nothing on that topic, as opposed to you've covered one point on each update and then maybe you've like forgotten to talk about customers this time, right? It's, I don't know if you got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think one thing always to think about whenever you're communicating in any context is like, who is the audience and what context do they have and what context don't they have? And so classic thing with like bad or like not ideal incident comms is when someone sends out some comms, it's got lots of jargon in it, or it's got lots of like stuff where if you were on that one project, it all makes sense. And if you weren't on that project, you're just like, this is all just meaningless. And then I think it's about ordering an update. Like people start reading from the top if you're going to do it in one paragraph. So make sure the first thing is the thing you really want them to know. And the second thing is the bit you'd quite like them to know. And the third thing is then the like, if you're interested, you might want to read on. And so I think like useful prompts are things like, what is the current state? Which often is really easy to forget when you're in an update because you're doing something, but it's like, where are we now? Even if it's where we, as Pete said, right, it could be the same place that we were half an hour ago or an hour ago or a day ago, if you're really unlucky. But it's like, what is the current situation and then like, what are we doing? And when do we think the situation might change? Those are fundamentally the things that people care about. And then maybe a fourth one is like, here is some more collateral that you might need. So there might be, we've written out some comms that we can send to customers. So if customers' questions come in, this is what you should send them. Or, this is a third-party outage. We're being affected by Heroku's got a DNS problem. So this is the link to the status page. So that is like pushing out sort of extra resources for people, if you like. But that should probably be at the end because it's kind of only the most interested people care about that. And so it's that kind of hierarchy of information. And then it's the predictability. So making sure that all of your updates have the same information in the same place, kind of like Pete was saying, right? So you can start to parse them. So the person who does only care about the first bit can just look at the first bit and then move on with their day.
Yeah, strong agree. I think one of the interesting things about this is like for tiny incidents, this is usually quite trivial. And you're often doing it for like internal benefit. Maybe it's like your team plus, I don't know, there's an EM who needs oversight so that they're comfortable, but like it's still a technical stakeholder. And as you get further and further away from the team, you're getting to kind of less and less domain expertise. You're also maybe getting to like folks that will interpret things wildly differently. So for example, I don't know, if you say, I think we're like quite unstable, that sounds very different in various contexts in technical sense to like the CEO being like, hang on, does this mean like my whole company is about to fall over, right? And so what you can sometimes end up with, and actually as you get to much, much bigger incidents, this becomes a lot more common, is actually there's now so many stakeholders that a single update doesn't quite cut it. because you're trying to write one message for like 5 different interpretations of the incident or levels of interpretation. So I think one thing that's I've seen before is maybe how you kick off like multiple comms loops. So you have a kind of maybe an infrequent comms loop of like an hourly comms loop for the business as a whole, where you write a very superficial high level update. And then you have like a more low level technical update for all the teams that need to be aware that we've currently frozen deploys. And like every 15 minutes, you're telling them like, nope, still frozen, but here's some details. And, so it's kind of interesting. You can end up with multiple loops. The question often is like, is that the same person who's now managing like multiple comms loops? Or do you have like one person does the small comms loop and then you have another sort of envelope person that takes that and aggregates it and rolls it up? And yeah,
I love it when I get to be the envelope person.
Yeah. It's like, I think that's an interesting point. It's not actually something that our product does at the moment. Maybe it's something we should think about doing, but I've ended up in incidents like that. I think they're quite rare, but they tend to be the horrendous ones where you're 4 days in and now you've got at least once a day you're updating the board, right? I've been in 2 or 3 incidents like that, and it's kind of that is not, Lisa, person on incident, writes quick update every 30 minutes, right? That's like we summarize top level business impact and how likely are we to still be alive in 3 days as a company. So yeah.
I didn't realize we'd be using the pod for sort of future feature requests as well. It's coming full circle now, this, isn't it?
Yeah. Coming up with ideas all the time. That's product team at Instant. I guess maybe we could talk a bit about. So I guess one thing that I've implicitly done there is assume that everyone has ability to see everything. And actually maybe like where that takes us slightly is like, well, there's different audiences and maybe not everyone should see everything. And like, should we even be sharing details of incidents, and when would we share or not share? I think like, I'm very biased. I think you should generally be very open and transparent, but there are probably good reasons or good motivations, even if I don't quite agree with them, for why people might not do what we've just been talking about, which I think is very good, but clearly not everyone does that, right? Like, I don't know. If you
definitely
have thoughts on that, Lisa, of just like when people haven't done this, not because they're not aware of it or because like they're bad at their job, right? But they've kind of like deliberately made a decision not to. Like, has that ever happened?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of different versions of this. So one version of this that I've definitely seen is there is a perception, and I think correctly, that the more you communicate, sometimes the more inbound you get. And so you're sort of creating work for yourself. And so as soon as you start like communicating with the entire company, suddenly you've got 20 questions coming back. And then you're like, oh, well, now I feel obliged to answer those questions as well. And that's taking me, that's taking time that maybe I don't have. And so you're trying to protect sort of the time of the incident team. I think for anything very serious, that's just like, cool, you need more people on your incident team. So that time is probably valuable. But there are also other ways of mitigating that, right? By being very clear with the audience that this is a really time-sensitive situation. There's not loads of people. We're communicating as best we can, but we don't necessarily have the bandwidth right now to answer your questions, kind of vibe, right? So there are other ways of dealing with that, but I think that's one thing that can make people quite reluctant to share.
Yep.
And then the other, and this is maybe more true for external comms, which I guess I'm not quite sure whether we're in internal, external, or both mode right now, but thinking more about external or large companies where there is lower trust and like lower familiarity, is there is this perception where like people might not take your transparency in the spirit that it was intended. And therefore they kind of use it as a stick to beat you with. So you say, oh, you start to be really, really transparent about all your incidents. And I think Monzo found this a little bit, where Monzo started to, they had this culture, it was like absolutely in their DNA. And every now and then somebody would go, oh, well, you can't use Monzo because they've got a really flaky platform. And you'd be like, they don't. They're just honest about it. They have the same, probably a less flaky platform, frankly, than a lot of their competitors. But because they are being open and transparent, the perception is that they've got more problems. And I think that is like that's a very, very legitimate reason to be quite careful about what you communicate. And that's really difficult because you are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place where, for me anyway, every bone in my body is telling me that we should be being really honest and open with our customers. And like, why wouldn't you do that? What have you got to lose? And then someone's like, oh, that however many £100,000 deal. And you're like, oh, maybe we do have something to lose. That's a bit more difficult now,
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I remember this at Monzo, and there were like several instances, some from before I joined and some while I was there, where it's kind of like In general, like Monzo is incredibly transparent. So for anyone listening, like there's not loads of dark secrets that they've hidden. It's actually the opposite. But it's out there being like, I am 90% sure that every single other bank is having exactly the same problems as this, but they're not talking about it. And then, Monzo gets raked over the coals and everyone's like, oh, you can't even prop your bank up. And we're like, do you have any idea like how good a job the team is doing and how amazing this is? Like we're giving you everything and there's barely anything. And then at other places, it's just like, they're just keeping quiet. Right. And I don't know. I guess at that point it's I know what I care about, but when you've got like 10 million customers or 5 million customers in Monzo's case, like, not everyone's going to be able to interpret that. Right. I think it's interesting because I think that principle applies internally a little bit as well. It's not quite the same, but I think there's a sort of, you could argue maybe let's assume like I'm a senior engineer in a team and, a lot of my identity is that people look up to me and they trust my opinions and I'm like a technical authority, right? And then like you're breaking stuff constantly, probably like, hopefully you're writing good tests and you're testing your work and, making sure that it's all doing what it's meant to do. But like, if you're not breaking things, you're probably not moving quick enough, honestly. And so you're going to have problems. The question is like, when you have them, do you quietly fix them and hide them and go, God, I hope nobody noticed because that would like tarnish my social capital? Or do you tell everyone, right? And I think whether that's an incident or whether that's just sort of fessing up and being open and transparent and authentic, I think a lot of people really struggle with that. I think it's much easier when you're later stage career. So like I have very few qualms about doing that, but I'm in a massive position of privilege in that I founded this company. Like I don't have, I have a lot of trust with my co-founders. There isn't really anyone who's going to look at me and go like, oh, I think Pete's really dropping the ball because he's reported like 20 bugs that he's added recently. Pete, right? Yeah, well, actually, there's not
a lot of that happens in the shadow channels.
Yeah, everyone picks apart my ancient code from the early days of Instant.io on a daily basis.
No.
But it's like
we pick apart your Twitter typos.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, there's a reason I'm not allowed to tweet from the company account anymore. And yeah, typos.
Does that tweet still exist, Lisa?
I think there might be
permanently.
Yeah, because they already have likes, so you can't get rid of them.
Well, I think there's actually a bit of a competition for listeners coming up here, which is if you can comment in whatever form one of Pete's typos, we will send the first person to do that some Instant.io swag.
It's a fun early Instant.io days activity was essentially me trying to tweet something, having not been on Twitter for ages, typoing it like an absolute moron, and then Chris and Stephen just rinsing me in our WhatsApp group and just going like, ha 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 ha, immediately liking it and retweeting it so that everyone else likes and retweets it, and then I can't like delete it without it being weird. Anyway, my point was, as a earlier stage career person, I think this is a really hard thing to do. So what you're essentially trying to prove is that like you deserve that promotion, you deserve that authority, that responsibility, that trust. At the same time, you're going like, look at all my failures. It's kind of a similar vibe, I think. I don't know how you feel, Lisa. I felt a little bit like this, and I had to really get used to it.
Yeah, I think it's really acute, either early stage career or when you join a new company, right? So basically, it's about how much social capital you have in the organization, and if the answer is a lot, like I'm in the same position here that you are, and I don't know. So we run incidents for any kind of. Basically any exception that comes out of our app. And I write quite a lot of code, and it turns out quite a lot of those exceptions are in one way or another due to something that I have done. And that is that's a trade-off I'm very comfortable with. And that means multiple times a week, I will jump into a minor incident channel and be like, oh yeah, this was me. Thanks for sorting that out. And I appreciate it. Whatever it is. Right. And that is something that I'm very relaxed about. And I'm very confident that the reaction to that is not the team thinking that I'm really bad at my job. If you join a company, you don't have that. Sorry, Charlie.
No, I was going to say, like, how much of that do you think is sort of the culture of declaring lots of incidents? So, like, ultimately, the bar for declaring an incident in our company is like pretty low, right? We want lots of incidents and like good transparency within those incidents. But with that, does that mean that you're more comfortable with saying like, oh, like there were 6 incidents that were my fault this week? Like almost, is this a way that companies that are struggling with this could move to a world where, people are even more happy to declare like, this was my fault. Like I screwed this up. This incident was because of me. Or is there something else here?
I think basically, I hope so. I think that's what's happening. So I think that like there are a couple of different reasons that we talk a lot about sort of declaring lots of incidents, and a lot of that is about getting a chance to practice your incident response process and all of that tooling being really, really smooth so that when the really bad thing does happen, you're only trying to do one new thing at a time, right? You're trying to solve whatever specific thing has gone wrong. You're not trying to generally learn how all of your tools fit together and where the status page is. And, does anyone have the login for this bit of monitoring? You're not having to do all of that at the same time, which I have done.
PTSD at this point.
Yes. I'm just watching Pete's face as I describe incidents that we've both been in over the years. But anyway, so that's part of it. But another part of it is definitely this transparency point, which is like, if you're really open, and lots of people are really open when they make mistakes, those mistakes become more common. And then you're not burning as much as your social capital because everyone around you is doing the same thing. And so it becomes like, everybody in the team has caused an incident in the last month. I say that, I think probably that's true, like probably in the last 3 weeks. And then it's like, well, so it clearly doesn't matter, right? We've not fired any of them because of it. We're not going to.
No.
And I think that is, if you, as the people with the social capital, you then have a responsibility to do that because that's what normalizes it for other people in your organization. And that's why people can then like copy that behavior and be confident that they're not going to get the same kind of blowback, I guess, because they've seen that there are other people who can admit that they're wrong. And one of the kind of worst things that you can ever do, I think, as like a leader in one of these orgs is like the flip side of that, which is to very publicly come down on someone really hard when they do make an error. Even if privately you're going, what on earth happened here? Like, I really didn't think we should have done that. If you have to have that conversation, you can have that in a different way and do it privately without it having that impact on the team. Whereas if you publicly like mock somebody, shame somebody, and humans live on their relationships with other people, right? They feel shame incredibly acutely. And so if you use that as a tool to like reprimand somebody, then you're going to have massive impact across all of the other people who've seen that happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is half the reason why we do the podcast, is because we can publicly mock Pete rather than for his incidents.
It's also why my role exists, right? Is to just be the public sort of destroyable face of engineering at Instant IO. It's a role that I relish. Just to maybe reinforce one thing on what Lisa said. I think that this gets a lot of lip service, so I don't think we need to talk about it loads. But I think there's a lot of good writing out there on kind of blameless instant culture. You'll hear like blameless postmortems being something that gets talked about a lot, or blameless debriefs. And I think that sort of stuff's also really important. Like you've got a few. There are several places where you as a leader or a senior person in a team can either sort of take advantage of an incident for massive upside or massive sort of positive gain for your team, or you can knock the culture negatively and you'll kind of set people on a negative spiral as opposed to like a positive one. So yeah, I think it's worth thinking hard about where those are for you. I mean, you do it all the time if you're a leader anyway, which is you're thinking about like, where can I encourage more of the behavior I want and discourage the behavior I don't want? And incidents are like, that's as hard as it gets, right? Everything's on fire. Everyone's stressed. No one has like extra emotional buffer, right? Like tensions are high. And it's like, that's where, how you react in that moment makes a huge difference. And if you crush your team or you shit all over the work that they're doing or the approach that they're taking, you guarantee next time this happens, either they're going to kind of, I don't know, be too stressed and not do anything.
Decision paralysis, right?
You're not going to hear about it because they're not going to be too scared to tell you. And then now your instant culture is like, the opposite of all the good stuff that me and Lisa have been trying to say that you should be doing for the rest of this podcast. So yeah, I just wanted to really reinforce that. I think maybe on the same principle, sort of, or on a similar note, maybe we could talk about external facing feedback. Because I feel like we've touched on it like 4 or 5 times now, and maybe we should just dive straight in and just spend a few minutes on it. I'm sure that's probably what you're about to do. Sorry, Charlie. I've like
you've answered your question, Peter. Feel free to answer that now.
Yeah, asked and answered. I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to probably throw it at Lisa. But I think we talked a little bit already about like the pros and cons of externally managing your instance well or communicating well. I guess sort of like maybe a couple of examples or like why this matters briefly, and then we can maybe do some practical tips on the same side. I just like Instant IO, we live and breathe this stuff, and it feels like that'd be a nice way to wrap up. So yeah, I don't know if you want to kind of give your thoughts, and then we can get into sort of bullet point list of things that we think people can do, and they can take that away for dessert.
Sure. So my go-to example on this is Atlassian. So Atlassian had an outage a few months ago, and it was a weird shaped outage. It's actually really unusual because it was a complete like blackout for a very small number of customers. It was like a few hundred customers, which for Atlassian is obviously a very, very small percentage of their customers.
People didn't know that at the beginning, right? It was a bit like sort of some proportion of their customers have lost it's crazy.
Yeah. And I thought that was really interesting because I spend maybe more time than I should reading engineering Twitter. And engineering Twitter for a week was absolutely fuming. I have almost never seen anything like it. And the whole of engineering Twitter was just like, this company is appalling. I can't believe they've done this. Their engineering practices are so bad. They're not talking to us. And it was really quite like vitriolic and kind of, the nasty side of the internet, quite frankly. And I think during that time, Atlassian had been communicating with the affected companies directly or with some of them, but maybe not all of them. And also, like, critically, what they had not done is to put anything really meaningful out into public. So their public status page was sort of something is happening. And then every few hours, yes, we're still working on it. And what I thought was really interesting is that about a week into this, their CTO published a really, really long, really detailed article explaining exactly what had happened, what they were doing, what the expected timelines were, kind of all the stuff that we've been talking about. And the tone of the conversation on Twitter completely changed from absolute vitriol, these people are the worst people in the world, through to like, oh my God, I have so much empathy for this poor person on the other end of this. And what they were trying to do, right? They basically accidentally deleted a bunch of data. And so they were having to restore all of the data from backups, which is like putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's like your worst nightmare. Yeah. As any, like I've had to do this once at my last company. And it really is the stuff of nightmares of sitting there with a database backup and you're desperately trying to work out which of the bits of data that you need to pull back in to rebuild this whole thing.
That's assuming your database backups are even like available and not on some like tape in cold storage in like a mountain somewhere, right? It's like, depends what data you've lost and when you lost it. And God.
Oh yeah. And it's as soon as you give people that amount of information and insight into what's going on, suddenly they're much more empathetic, they're much more understanding, and they give you a lot more time. And the fact that it then took Atlassian another week or two to like restore service across everyone's accounts wasn't such a problem anymore. Yeah. There were questions about exactly what had happened. There was a really bad script. It shouldn't have been allowed to run. It was allowed to run. That had like a very, very serious impact for a large number of companies. But that's what people were talking about, which is a much healthier conversation than the sort of like, who the hell are these people and they don't know what they're doing, which is, Atlassian are a very large, successful company and they do absolutely know what they're doing. Yeah. But that is not always how the internet perceives it.
Yeah, agreed. What can people do? How can they get this positive vibes?
Well, Pete,
just as we practiced.
I think it's like
we have not practiced this, so we are shooting from the hip. I've reached the point in the podcast where I'm just repeatedly throwing stuff at Lisa and just getting her to take us home.
It's providing lots and lots of context or enough, the right amount of context, I guess, actually, is a better answer to that, to help minimize speculation and explain to people enough of what's happened for them to have some empathy. Saying something has gone wrong in the big black box, people don't have empathy for that. It's kind of the same as if your colleague is like, I'm taking 2 weeks off, bye. Even if you have all the best intentions in the world, it's really easy to feel like, oh, they're kind of abandoning us in this time of need. But if they explain what's happening, even at a very like light level of detail, all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, off you go, take all the time you need, we'll handle it. Yeah. It's exactly the same when you're communicating. And so it's giving people confidence that you know what you're doing because you have actually understood what's happening, giving them a timeline so that they can adapt their behavior. So if I know that I'm not going to have any of my Jira data for a week or 2 weeks, I can make a good choice. If I'm like, my Jira data might turn up tomorrow or it might turn up never or anything in between, and I don't know when, that's much more stressful for me. I can't make good choices. And I'm now going to start shouting at you until you give me that answer.
Yep.
And so, sorry, I've not structured this particularly well, but lots of context.
Right.
Make sure people know that you're on it. Give them a clear expectation of like when things are going to change, and also what is actually wrong for them right now, so that they don't continually try things that are broken, for example.
Yeah, 100%. I think that there's not a huge amount I'd add to that, honestly, and a lot of it's the same as what you do internally. It's just contextualizing it to your customers. I think that on the context point, I think avoiding too much detail is really important, and it's frustrating because I think often if you provide lots of detail, what happens is someone like slams you So you sort of mention a particular technology, and they're like, "What do you mean you can't even use Kubernetes?" And it's sort of you end up having these like, someone picks up on it as like, "Oh, I would be able to fix this really fast." But you kind of got to be able to put that aside. The real reason you don't do that is like for most of your customers, it doesn't mean anything, and that's the reason you should hold back. And then I think the other thing is just being very prompt. So kind of like one of the things I've done before is like, even if you're providing regular updates or you're sort of providing quick updates when you change state, even if the answer is like, we're not really nothing has really changed, but I'm confirming that nothing has really changed, because they don't have the option of just going like, oh, well, I'll just join your incident channel to collect the fire hose if I'm not getting the regular updates that I want. From a customer's perspective, they're blind. And actually the way that they'll do that is they will hammer your support team, who will then they'll be coming to you and asking for a holding message. So you might as well help them out and just put one up there. But yeah, strong agree with all of that. Don't have much more to add, I don't think.
Great. Well, thank you both, Lisa and Pete, for your time today. I'm going to drop into the show notes a link to a talk that Lisa gave a few months back now, Lisa.
Yeah, we haven't plugged any people's talks. I always plug people's talks.
We have not plugged.
Go watch Lisa's talk. There you go.
It's really good. That's how she got the gig on this pod.
They don't trust me otherwise. I needed to prove myself.
Absolutely not. And then Pete also mentioned the guide that we put together, which is an incident management guide. We'll drop a link to that in the show notes as well. But thank you both again for joining me on the pod, and we will see you, the audience, again in hopefully a week. I think it's been 2 weeks since the last one. Apologies. We will get better at this. But
I think we have. We got together as a founding team, I think, and we did a little one that we may or may not release. We need to make a decision on that.
That's what happens when Charlie goes on holiday.
I know, we just sort of messed around with the podcast recording stuff for an hour. But no, it's good. Also, I think like if people I assume or I'd hope that at least one or two people are listening to this. And
I am shouting into the void.
Yeah, either that or we're just having lovely chats. If you are and you have stuff that you'd love to hear us talk about, either like the engineers on the team or like the company as a whole, let us know. Be really, really interested. We've got a big list of topics and we'll just churn through them. But if anyone has stuff they'd love to hear more about, like let us know and we can dive into that instead. We sort of spend all our life in instance, so it's our favourite topic.
And on that bombshell, see you soon.